High above the Pacific coast of South America rises a wall of mountains so immense that early travelers believed the earth itself had been folded upward by the hands of gods. These are the Andes, a spine of stone stretching thousands of kilometers where thin air, sharp light, and brutal cliffs create one of the most demanding environments any civilization has ever attempted to master. Yet within this unforgiving geography, a people would construct an empire of astonishing scale, engineering brilliance, and political imagination. The Inca Empire, known to its people as Tawantinsuyu, the four parts together, emerged not from fertile river valleys or gentle plains, but from the steep terraces and high plateaus of the central Andes. In little more than a century, it would expand across deserts, jungles, and mountain corridors, uniting millions of people speaking different languages under a single imperial vision. But the rise of the Incas was neither inevitable nor simple. Their story begins in uncertainty, legend, and survival, for before emperors commanded vast armies and architects carved cities into mountain ridges, the ancestors of the Inca were only one small community struggling to endure in a harsh and competitive world. The question that echoes through Andean history is therefore profound. How did a modest highland lineage transform itself into the greatest empire ever seen in the Americas before European arrival? To answer that question, we must travel back to the beginning, where myth, memory, and archaeology converge in the ancient city of Cusco. According to Inca tradition, the origins of their royal line were not ordinary but sacred. Legends told of ancestors emerging from caves, lakes, or sacred windows in the earth, guided by the sun god Inti. Among the most enduring stories describes Manco Capac and Mama Aklo, siblings and partners sent by the sun to bring order to a chaotic world. Carrying a golden staff, they journeyed across valleys and ridges until the staff sank easily into fertile soil. There they founded Cusco, the navel of the world. Whether myth, allegory, or political memory, these stories served an essential purpose. They explained why the Inca ruler was not merely a king, but the living descendant of the sun, divine authority embodied in human form. Such beliefs would later justify conquest, obedience, and empire. Yet behind the sacred narrative historians detect something equally important: migration. During the centuries before Inca expansion, the Andes were home to many competing societies. Some built powerful regional states. Others organized around fortified towns and agricultural terraces. Climatic shifts, droughts, and conflicts repeatedly reshaped the political landscape. Communities moved, merged, fractured, and adapted. It is within this dynamic environment that the ancestors of the Inca likely migrated into the Cusco Valley sometime around the 12th or 13th century. At first, they were not dominant. Archaeological evidence suggests the valley already contained several rival groups, each defending farmland, water, and sacred territory. Survival demanded alliances, marriages, diplomacy, and sometimes violence. The early Inca leaders therefore ruled not an empire but a fragile chiefdom, whose authority depended on negotiation and persuasion. Their settlement at Cusco grew gradually into a ceremonial and political center. Stone foundations began to replace simple dwellings. Fields were carved into terraces that captured water and sunlight. Llamas carried goods along narrow mountain paths. Priests observed the skies, measuring seasons by the rising of constellations. Every element of life revolved around adaptation to altitude, soil, and climate. These highland innovations would later become the technological foundation of empire. Still, power in the Andes remained fragmented. For generations, Cusco existed among rivals, stronger neighbors threatening war and humiliation. Oral traditions speak of raids, ambushes, and desperate defenses during these early centuries. The Inca were learning not only how to farm mountains but how to survive politics. When leadership passed from one ruler to another, each generation experimented with new strategies. Some pursued diplomacy. Others tested military expansion. Slowly, prestige accumulated around the royal lineage. Temples honoring Inti rose above the valley. Festivals reinforced loyalty between communities and their sacred rulers. Yet the transformation from vulnerable settlement to rising power would not occur until a moment of existential crisis. In the early 15th century, a formidable confederation known as the Chanca advanced toward Cusco, determined to destroy the growing Inca state. According to later chronicles, fear spread through the valley. Many nobles prepared to flee, believing resistance was hopeless. The reigning ruler Viracocha Inca reportedly withdrew from the capital, leaving the city vulnerable. Yet in this moment of danger, a young prince refused surrender. His name was Qc Yupanqui. Gathering loyal warriors, he organized the defense of Cusco. Fortifications were strengthened, weapons prepared. Messengers raced through allied communities calling for support. The confrontation that followed would become one of the defining legends of Andean history. Chroniclers later described fierce combat across fields and hillsides, where the fate of Cusco hung in the balance. Whether embellished or remembered accurately, the outcome is clear. The Chanca were defeated. Cusco survived. Victory transformed the young defender into a legendary figure. Taking the throne, he adopted a new name: Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, the ruler who overturns the world. Under Pachacuti, the destiny of the Inca would change forever. For he possessed something rare in Andean leadership, a vision not merely of survival, but of empire. Pachacuti reorganized Cusco itself, turning the city into a sacred imperial capital. Streets were aligned with cosmic symbolism. Administrative districts reflected the four regions of Tawantinsuyu. Noble lineages received defined responsibilities within the expanding state. More importantly, Pachacuti transformed warfare. Instead of seasonal raids, the Inca began systematic campaigns aimed at permanent incorporation of neighboring peoples. Diplomacy preceded battle. Envoys offered alliance, trade, and protection. Those who accepted retained local authority under imperial oversight. Those who resisted faced disciplined armies supported by logistical planning unusual for the ancient world. Storehouses, roads, and labor obligations allowed the state to move soldiers and supplies across daunting terrain. Conquest therefore became not chaos, but administration. As territories expanded, Pachacuti also reshaped ideology. Subject communities were integrated through ritual architecture and state ceremonies. Temples dedicated to the sun linked distant provinces to Cusco. Local elites were invited, or compelled, to participate in imperial festivals, learning the administrative language of Quechua. Meanwhile, artisans, engineers, and farmers contributed their skills to state projects. Terraces multiplied along mountainsides. Irrigation canals extended agriculture into marginal lands. The empire grew not only by sword but by organization. Yet expansion also carried risks. Each newly incorporated people required supervision, tribute, and loyalty. Maintaining balance between local autonomy and imperial authority demanded constant attention. Pachacuti understood that durable power required institutions, not merely victories. Therefore, he began constructing the administrative framework that would sustain Inca rule for generations. Governors, census officials, and labor managers recorded populations and obligations using knotted cords known as quipu. Information traveled along relay runners who crossed mountains with astonishing speed. By the middle of the 15th century, the transformation was undeniable. Cusco had become the command center of a rapidly expanding imperial system. Pachacuti himself oversaw campaigns deep into the Andes, securing valleys rich in maize, coca, and precious metals. His generals pushed influence toward the Pacific coast and into the high plateau surrounding Lake Titicaca. Everywhere the empire advanced, roads followed. Way stations, storehouses, and administrative centers appeared across landscapes once divided by rivalry. Yet the greatest symbol of Pachacuti's ambition may have been the royal estate of Machu Picchu, perched high above the Urubamba River. Hidden among forested peaks, the stone city embodied the synthesis of engineering, cosmology, and imperial power. Terraces stabilized slopes, temples aligned with celestial events, fountains channeled mountain springs with elegant precision. Machu Picchu was not merely a retreat. It was a statement that the Inca state could command stone, water, labor, and landscape itself. As Pachacuti aged, he prepared the succession, ensuring that expansion would continue under his son Topa Inca Yupanqui. The foundations of empire had been laid, but the most dramatic phase of conquest still lay ahead. For beyond the mountains and deserts already reached stretched vast territories unknown to Cusco. Rumors spoke of wealthy coastal kingdoms, dense tropical forests, and distant peoples whose allegiance had never been claimed. If Tawantinsuyu was to become a true empire, it would require leaders capable of projecting power across thousands of kilometers and integrating cultures profoundly different from those of the highlands. The achievements of Pachacuti therefore represented both triumph and challenge. He had transformed a threatened city into the nucleus of imperial ambition. Yet the durability of that ambition depended on the generations who followed. Would they preserve unity or fracture under the strain of expansion? History would soon deliver the answer. For the heirs of Pachacuti inherited not a modest kingdom but a rising imperial machine. Armies grew larger. Roads stretched farther. Storehouses filled with maize, textiles, and dried meat. Across the Andes, a new political order was emerging, disciplined, organized, and guided by the belief that the rulers of Cusco carried the mandate of the sun itself. But the greater the empire became, the more difficult unity would be to maintain. Diversity of language, geography, and tradition demanded constant negotiation between center and province. Loyalty had to be cultivated through ceremony, redistribution, and vigilant governance. The Inca understood that empire was not merely conquered land but maintained relationships between ruler and subject, between gods and humanity, between mountains, rivers, and the people who lived among them. In the coming decades, these relationships would be tested by further conquest, administrative reform, and the ambitions of powerful rulers. The empire would reach its greatest territorial extent, stretching along the spine of the Andes for thousands of kilometers. Yet greatness often carries hidden vulnerabilities. The systems that unified Tawantinsuyu could also magnify crisis if leadership faltered. For now, however, the Inca world stood at the threshold of its greatest expansion. And at the center of that expanding world stood Cusco, sacred capital of the sun, where rulers claimed descent from divine ancestors and administrators planned the future of millions. The story of the Inca Empire was only beginning. The next era would push Tawantinsuyu to its greatest height, forging a realm that dominated nearly the entire Andean world. But when power grows vast, the struggle to control it becomes the greatest challenge of all. The empire Pachacuti forged was not yet complete. It was a powerful beginning, a rising constellation of territories tied to Cusco through loyalty, tribute, and fear. But empires rarely remain static. They either expand or fracture. For the Inca state, the next generation would determine which path history would follow. As Pachacuti aged, leadership responsibilities increasingly shifted toward his chosen successor, Topa Inca Yupanqui. Unlike the cautious early rulers of Cusco, Topa inherited something unprecedented in Andean history, a disciplined imperial system already in motion. Roads stretched across valleys, armies had proven their strength, and neighboring societies had begun to recognize the rising authority of the sun's descendants. Yet inheritance alone did not guarantee greatness. The Andes were still a vast mosaic of independent cultures, fortified towns, and powerful regional lords. To transform the Inca state into a truly continental empire required a ruler capable of relentless expansion and careful integration. Topa Inca Yupanqui would become that ruler. From the moment he assumed the mantle of command, the rhythm of conquest intensified. Pachacuti had expanded the borders of Cusco's influence, but Topa would push them farther than anyone before him imagined possible. His campaigns began in the highlands south of Cusco, where the rugged plateau surrounding Lake Titicaca had long supported influential communities with deep cultural traditions. The region was not easily subdued. Its inhabitants were accustomed to altitude, resilient agriculture, and defense across open plains. But the Inca war machine had evolved. Armies now moved in coordinated formations, supported by supply depots filled with dried meat, maize, and woven garments. Engineers cleared pathways through difficult terrain. Messengers carried commands along relay networks that allowed the emperor's voice to travel across mountains within days. This logistical revolution changed the nature of warfare in the Andes. Battles were no longer isolated struggles between neighboring tribes. They became campaigns planned months in advance, integrating diplomacy, psychological pressure, and overwhelming force. When Inca envoys arrived at the gates of rival cities, they offered a choice: submit peacefully, and local leaders would retain status under imperial protection. Resist, and the consequences could be devastating. Many communities chose submission. Others fought. In every direction, Topa Inca Yupanqui tested the limits of his empire's reach. To the south, his armies advanced through the Altiplano into territories that today form parts of Bolivia and northern Chile. Coastal valleys rich with irrigation agriculture fell under imperial supervision. Each new conquest strengthened the empire's economic base, but territorial expansion required more than military victory. It demanded administration. To govern a growing population, the Inca state refined a system unlike any other in the pre-Columbian Americas. Rather than relying on currency or markets, the empire operated through structured labor obligations known as mita. Every household contributed labor to the state for part of the year. Men built roads, terraces, and temples. Women wove textiles destined for imperial storehouses. Farmers cultivated fields that supplied food for armies and administrators. In return, the state redistributed resources during times of scarcity, supported widows and orphans, and organized large-scale infrastructure projects. This system allowed the empire to mobilize immense human energy without the need for coinage. It also bound diverse communities into a shared imperial economy. As Topa expanded the frontiers, he also strengthened the ideological foundations of rule. Inca religion centered upon the sun god Inti, but the empire never sought to erase local spiritual traditions entirely. Instead, sacred landscapes were woven into a broader imperial cosmology. Important regional deities were recognized, their temples integrated into the network of state ritual. Priests from Cusco traveled with armies, performing ceremonies that linked conquest to divine approval. In this way, political authority and spiritual legitimacy reinforced one another. Meanwhile, the capital itself underwent transformation. Cusco grew into a monumental city of stone walls, ceremonial plazas, and administrative compounds. Its layout symbolized the four regions of Tawantinsuyu: Chinchaysuyu to the northwest, Antisuyu to the east, Calasuyu to the south, and Kuntasuyu to the west. From this sacred center, the emperor governed an expanding world. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Topa Inca Yupanqui was the completion of the imperial road system. Known collectively as the Quhapac Nyan, these roads stretched thousands of kilometers along the spine of the Andes and across coastal deserts. Suspension bridges spanned deep canyons. Staircases carved into cliffs allowed passage through seemingly impossible terrain. Along the route stood tambos, way stations where travelers could rest, resupply, and receive instructions. Relay runners called chasquis carried messages between these stations with astonishing speed. The result was a communication network capable of linking distant provinces directly to Cusco. Information flowed continuously. Orders traveled quickly. Empire became manageable. As imperial authority spread, Topa Inca Yupanqui turned his attention toward the northern Andes, where some of the most complex societies in the region had developed. These lands were fertile and densely populated, producing cotton, maize, cacao, and exotic feathers prized in ceremonial clothing. But conquest here would not be easy. Northern kingdoms possessed sophisticated fortifications and experienced warriors. Campaigns lasted years rather than seasons. Still, the Inca emperor advanced with patience and determination. His generals adapted strategies to local geography, sometimes bypassing heavily defended cities to isolate them economically. Other times, they forged alliances with rival factions within contested regions. Slowly, resistance weakened. Province by province, the northern territories were incorporated into Tawantinsuyu. Yet expansion also demanded cultural negotiation. Languages differed widely across the Andes. To facilitate administration, the empire promoted Quechua as an official language of governance. Local leaders were educated in its use, allowing imperial officials to communicate policies and organize labor. At the same time, the state encouraged the movement of populations through a policy known as mitmakuna. Communities considered rebellious could be relocated far from their homelands, while loyal groups were settled in newly conquered territories. These migrations reshaped the demographic map of the Andes. They reduced the risk of regional rebellion and spread Inca cultural practices across vast distances. The empire was becoming not merely a political entity, but a shared system of identity. Even so, Topa Inca Yupanqui remained aware that the authority of Cusco ultimately depended on the perception of the emperor himself. In Inca ideology, the ruler was more than administrator or general. He was the living embodiment of divine lineage. Public ceremonies reinforced this sacred image. During festivals, the emperor appeared adorned in brilliant textiles and gold ornaments that reflected sunlight like living fire. Nobles gathered in the great plazas of Cusco to witness rituals honoring the sun, the earth, and the ancestors. These spectacles reminded subjects that imperial order mirrored cosmic harmony. Under Topa's leadership, the empire reached extraordinary scale. From the deserts of northern Chile to the high valleys approaching modern Ecuador, millions of people now lived within the orbit of Tawantinsuyu. Agricultural terraces covered mountainsides like stairways of stone. Storehouses lined major roads, stocked with maize, quinoa, dried fish, and wool garments. For the first time in Andean history, a single political system connected the majority of the region's civilizations. Yet success carried hidden tensions. The larger the empire grew, the more difficult it became to maintain unity among its diverse populations. Some provinces accepted Inca rule with pragmatic cooperation. Others complied outwardly while nurturing resentment beneath the surface. Rebellions erupted occasionally, requiring swift military response. Topa Inca Yupanqui understood that conquest alone could not sustain an empire forever. He therefore invested heavily in infrastructure that demonstrated tangible benefits of imperial membership. Roads enabled trade between ecological zones. Highland communities gained access to coastal goods such as dried fish and cotton. Lowland regions received hardy mountain crops capable of thriving in difficult climates. These exchanges strengthened economic interdependence, but they also deepened the administrative burden on Cusco. By the time Topa approached the later years of his reign, Tawantinsuyu had become the largest empire ever established in the Western Hemisphere before European contact. Its population numbered in the millions. Its territory stretched across deserts, rainforests, and high plateaus. Its government coordinated labor, agriculture, religion, and communication on a scale unmatched in the Americas. Yet one question remained unresolved. Could such an enormous system survive beyond the lifetime of the rulers who built it? The Inca succession system was complex. The emperor selected an heir among his sons, but powerful noble families also held influence in determining legitimacy. Rivalries could easily emerge during transitions of power. Topa Inca Yupanqui therefore faced the challenge that haunts all empire builders. He had expanded Tawantinsuyu to unprecedented size. But could he ensure stability after his death? As age and illness gradually overtook the conqueror, preparations for succession intensified within Cusco. Noble lineages debated alliances. Priests interpreted omens. The future of the empire depended on the next Sapa Inca. Eventually, the throne would pass to Huayna Capac, a ruler raised within the expanding imperial order and determined to preserve its strength. But Huayna Capac would inherit not only a powerful state, he would inherit its vulnerabilities. The immense size of Tawantinsuyu demanded constant coordination across mountains and deserts. Local loyalties still competed with imperial identity. Military campaigns remained necessary to maintain authority along distant frontiers. The system was magnificent, but delicate. And beyond the Andes, forces completely unknown to the Inca world were beginning to stir across distant oceans. For now, however, the empire stood at the height of confidence, its armies undefeated, its roads unbroken, its emperor remembered as the conqueror who carried the banners of the sun across nearly the entire Andean world. Yet history teaches that the peak of power often arrives just before the first signs of decline. The next chapter would reveal whether Tawantinsuyu could sustain the greatness forged by Pachacuti and expanded by Topa Inca Yupanqui, or whether the seeds of crisis had already begun to grow beneath the shining empire of the sun. Empires often reach their greatest brilliance in the generation that inherits them. The architects of expansion establish foundations through war and ambition, but their successors transform conquest into stability, culture, and administrative maturity. For the Inca Empire, that generation arrived with the reign of Huayna Capac. When Huayna Capac ascended the throne in the late 15th century, Tawantinsuyu already stretched across vast distances. Roads connected deserts, mountains, and forests. Armies loyal to Cusco had subdued rival states. Storehouses brimmed with the products of imperial labor. Yet the empire remained unfinished. Its borders were still contested. Some newly conquered regions required deeper integration into the political and cultural system of the Inca state. And beyond the northern frontier lay territories, rich in resources and population, that had not yet submitted to the authority of Cusco. Huayna Capac inherited not merely a throne, but a mission: to consolidate the largest empire in the Americas and extend its influence farther than ever before. Unlike the earlier rulers who had built Tawantinsuyu through aggressive expansion, Huayna Capac ruled during a period when imperial systems were already functioning at full scale. His challenge therefore required a different kind of leadership. He needed to balance conquest with governance. His reign would be defined by campaigns across the northern Andes, a region of fertile valleys and strong local kingdoms. These lands, particularly in what is now Ecuador and southern Colombia, possessed agricultural wealth and strategic significance. Control of the region would secure the empire's northern defenses and open new trade networks. But the northern Andes were fiercely independent. Unlike some highland communities that had submitted to earlier Inca diplomacy, northern societies often resisted integration with remarkable determination. Fortified settlements guarded mountain passes. Local leaders commanded experienced warriors familiar with the rugged terrain. For Huayna Capac, conquering the north would become the central project of his reign. He led campaigns personally, traveling with vast armies supported by the logistical networks perfected under Pachacuti and Topa Inca Yupanqui. Roads were extended farther into the northern mountains, while supply depots ensured that soldiers could operate for long periods far from Cusco. The campaigns were difficult and sometimes brutal. Years of warfare passed before many regions finally submitted to imperial authority. Yet Huayna Capac demonstrated a strategic understanding of governance once victory was achieved. Instead of ruling solely from the distant capital, he established new administrative centers in the northern provinces. One of the most important was the city of Tombamba, which he developed into a secondary royal residence. This decision reflected a critical shift in imperial policy. By spending extended periods in the north, Huayna Capac could directly supervise newly conquered territories while maintaining close relationships with local elites. In many ways, the emperor was transforming Tawantinsuyu into a multi-centered empire, one that could govern distant provinces without relying entirely on Cusco. The strategy strengthened imperial control. Local leaders who once resisted conquest were gradually incorporated into the administrative hierarchy. They provided labor, soldiers, and tribute while retaining certain cultural traditions under the oversight of Inca officials. At the same time, Huayna Capac continued to promote the unifying cultural elements that defined Tawantinsuyu. Quechua remained the language of governance. State festivals honored Inti, the sun god whose divine lineage legitimized the emperor's authority. Infrastructure projects expanded across the empire. Terraces increased agricultural productivity in mountainous regions. Irrigation systems allowed cultivation in previously marginal lands. Storehouses filled with surplus food, providing security during years of drought or crop failure. Under Huayna Capac, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. From southern Colombia to central Chile, and across the Andes toward the fringes of the Amazon basin, millions of people now lived within the political orbit of the Inca state. Few civilizations in the Americas had ever achieved such scale. Yet managing this immense territory required constant vigilance. Provincial governors monitored labor obligations and resource distribution. Quipu specialists recorded census data, tracking populations and production levels. Relay runners carried reports between administrative centers and the imperial court. The system functioned with remarkable efficiency. But the larger the empire grew, the more fragile the balance became. Regional differences in culture, language, and geography demanded careful negotiation between imperial authority and local identity. Too much pressure could provoke rebellion. Too little could weaken loyalty to Cusco. Huayna Capac spent much of his reign navigating this delicate equilibrium. At the heart of his rule was the concept of reciprocity, a fundamental principle in Andean political culture. The emperor expected loyalty and labor from his subjects, but he also provided protection, food redistribution, and monumental projects that benefited entire communities. Large public works served not only practical purposes, but also political symbolism. When thousands of workers gathered to construct roads, temples, or terraces, they participated directly in the creation of imperial order. Their labor linked personal identity with the greater structure of Tawantinsuyu. In this way, the empire was constantly being rebuilt by the people who lived within it. Yet despite these achievements, signs of tension were beginning to emerge during the later years of Huayna Capac's reign. The northern campaigns had drawn the emperor far from Cusco for extended periods. While the strategy strengthened control in newly conquered regions, it also shifted the center of political gravity within the empire. Powerful noble families in the capital sometimes found themselves distant from imperial decision-making. Meanwhile, the northern provinces gained increasing importance within the administrative network. Such shifts carried long-term consequences. They introduced new rivalries among elite factions, each seeking influence over the future direction of the empire. More troubling still were events unfolding beyond the awareness of the Inca world. Far across the Atlantic Ocean, European explorers had begun arriving in the Americas. Their journeys introduced unfamiliar diseases that traveled silently across continents long before direct contact with many indigenous civilizations. Smallpox, one of the most devastating diseases in human history, spread gradually through trade routes and human movement across the Americas. By the early 16th century, the epidemic reached regions bordering the Inca Empire. The population had no immunity. Communities that had never seen European ships or soldiers were suddenly confronted with an invisible enemy capable of killing thousands. When smallpox finally entered Tawantinsuyu, the consequences were catastrophic. Entire villages were struck by illness. Agricultural production faltered as labor forces diminished. Social structures that depended on communal cooperation faced unprecedented strain. Among those affected by the epidemic was the emperor himself. Huayna Capac fell ill during his time in the northern provinces. Despite the resources of the imperial court and the prayers of priests, the disease proved unstoppable. The ruler who had expanded the empire to its greatest size died far from Cusco. His death created an immediate crisis. The Inca succession system, though structured, often produced rivalry among potential heirs. Huayna Capac had several sons, but two figures quickly emerged as the primary claimants to the throne. One was Huascar, based in Cusco and supported by many members of the traditional nobility. The other was Atahualpa, who had grown up in the northern territories and commanded the loyalty of experienced military leaders stationed there. The empire now faced a dangerous uncertainty. With the emperor dead and political factions divided, Tawantinsuyu stood on the edge of internal conflict. What had once been a unified system of governance suddenly appeared vulnerable to fragmentation. The death of Huayna Capac, therefore, marked a turning point in Andean history. For decades, the Inca state had expanded with remarkable speed and coordination. Its rulers had commanded loyalty through military strength, economic redistribution, and divine legitimacy. But now the question of succession threatened to unravel the delicate balance that held the empire together. Huascar and Atahualpa represented more than rival princes. They embodied competing visions of imperial leadership shaped by different regions and political alliances. As tensions escalated, alliances hardened among provincial governors and military commanders. Messengers carried urgent communications across the road network. The empire that had once used its infrastructure to coordinate expansion now used the same system to prepare for civil war. The coming conflict would be unlike any struggle the Inca had faced before. It would not be fought against external enemies or rebellious provinces. It would be fought between brothers, each claiming the sacred right to rule Tawantinsuyu. And while the empire prepared for this internal battle, another force was moving closer to the Andes. Spanish conquistadors, driven by ambition and rumor of wealth, had begun exploring the Pacific coast of South America. Their numbers were small, their knowledge limited, but their technology and motivations would soon collide with a civilization already weakened by disease and division. The timing of these events would prove catastrophic. For just as the Inca Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, it began to fracture from within. The civil war between Huascar and Atahualpa would drain resources, divide loyalties, and disrupt the administrative order built over generations. When foreign invaders finally entered the Andes, they would encounter not a unified empire but a kingdom already struggling to hold itself together. The death of Huayna Capac had closed one era of imperial confidence. What followed would determine whether Tawantinsuyu could survive the storms gathering on every horizon. The death of Huayna Capac left the Inca Empire without its central pillar of authority. For decades, his leadership had balanced expansion with governance, holding together a vast political system that stretched across thousands of kilometers of mountains and valleys. Now that pillar had collapsed. What followed was not immediate chaos but a gradual tightening of tension, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Two men now stood at the center of imperial destiny. Huascar, the son supported by many of the traditional noble families in Cusco, believed the throne was his rightful inheritance. Raised within the ceremonial and political heart of the empire, he embodied the continuity of Inca tradition and the authority of the capital. But another claimant possessed power of a different kind. Atahualpa had grown to prominence in the northern provinces, where Huayna Capac had spent much of his later reign. There he gained the loyalty of veteran generals and hardened soldiers who had fought in long campaigns across the northern Andes. These armies were disciplined, experienced, and fiercely loyal to the prince who had shared their hardships. The stage was set for a conflict that would tear the empire apart. At first, both sides attempted to assert legitimacy through diplomacy and symbolism, rather than immediate war. Messages traveled along the imperial roads, each prince declaring himself the rightful Sapa Inca, the unique ruler chosen by divine ancestry. Yet legitimacy in Tawantinsuyu required more than proclamations. It required recognition from powerful noble lineages, the support of military commanders, and the acceptance of provincial governors responsible for vast territories. Huascar possessed strong backing in Cusco and among many established elites. Atahualpa controlled the loyalty of northern armies and the strategic city of Quito. Neither side was willing to surrender. The fragile unity that had once defined Tawantinsuyu began to fracture. The first confrontations occurred not in massive battles but through arrests, executions, and political purges. Huascar, attempting to consolidate power, moved aggressively against those suspected of supporting his brother. Several nobles and military leaders were imprisoned or executed. These actions, meant to secure the throne, instead deepened resentment. In the north, Atahualpa interpreted the purges as a declaration of hostility. His generals, particularly the experienced commanders Chalcachima and Quizquiz, began organizing armies for open confrontation. Thus began the Inca Civil War. Unlike earlier campaigns against external rivals, this conflict pitted Inca against Inca. Soldiers marched under the same banners that had once united the empire in conquest. Now those banners divided brother from brother. The war unfolded across the rugged landscapes of the Andes. Armies traveled along the imperial road system that Pachacuti and Topa Inca Yupanqui had built to unify the empire. Ironically, the same infrastructure that once strengthened imperial cohesion now accelerated its destruction. Battles erupted across valleys and highlands. At first, Huascar appeared to hold the advantage. His authority in Cusco gave him access to the administrative machinery of the empire and the symbolic power of the capital. But Atahualpa possessed superior military leadership. His generals had spent years commanding troops in the difficult northern campaigns. They understood strategy, discipline, and the importance of coordinated movement across the mountainous terrain. One of the earliest major clashes occurred near the region of Tumibamba. Huascar's forces initially captured Atahualpa, creating the impression that the conflict might end quickly. Yet fortune soon reversed. Atahualpa managed to escape captivity, reportedly aided by loyal followers who remained determined to restore his claim. Once free, he regrouped his armies and prepared for a counteroffensive that would reshape the course of the war. From that moment forward, the conflict intensified dramatically. Atahualpa's generals launched a series of decisive campaigns, pushing southward through territories that had once served as the backbone of imperial expansion. Their tactics combined direct assault with strategic intimidation. Cities that resisted were punished harshly, while those that submitted were spared. This approach gradually shifted the balance of power. One by one, the provinces that had supported Huascar began to fall under Atahualpa's control. His armies demonstrated ruthless efficiency, capturing strategic strongholds and dismantling rival command structures. The psychological impact of these victories proved enormous. Communities that once pledged loyalty to Cusco now reconsidered their allegiance. The empire's unity began to unravel. As the conflict progressed, the brutality of civil war became increasingly evident. Executions of captured nobles, destruction of rival estates, and forced relocations of populations spread fear across the Andes. The principle of reciprocity that had once bound the empire together gave way to suspicion and vengeance. For ordinary people, the war was devastating. Farmers abandoned fields as armies marched through agricultural regions. Storehouses meant to sustain communities during famine were emptied to feed soldiers. Labor networks that had once constructed roads and terraces now supported the machinery of war. The empire's administrative system, once its greatest strength, was being consumed by internal conflict. Meanwhile, Atahualpa continued advancing toward the heart of Tawantinsuyu. His generals defeated Huascar's armies in several major engagements, including a decisive victory near the city of Cusco itself. The once proud capital of the empire faced the unimaginable prospect of occupation by its own imperial forces. Eventually, Huascar was captured. The man who claimed the sacred throne of the sun was now a prisoner of his brother's army. Atahualpa had effectively won the civil war, but victory came at enormous cost. Years of fighting had drained the empire's resources. Regional loyalties had fractured. Trust between noble families was shattered. Even worse, the administrative networks that once coordinated the empire were weakened by the removal or execution of experienced officials. Tawantinsuyu remained vast, but its internal cohesion was dangerously fragile. Atahualpa, now the uncontested ruler, established his court in the northern city of Cajamarca, while preparations began for formal consolidation of power across the empire. From this position, he issued commands to provincial governors, reorganized administrative offices, and began addressing the political aftermath of the Civil War. Yet he never had the opportunity to fully restore stability. For while the Inca Empire fought itself, a small group of foreign adventurers was approaching the Andean world. These men were Spanish conquistadors led by Francisco Pizarro. Unlike the vast armies of the Inca, Pizarro's force numbered fewer than 200 soldiers. Yet they carried weapons unknown in the Andes, steel swords, firearms, and horses that appeared to indigenous observers as terrifying beasts of war. Even more significant than their weapons was their timing. When Pizarro and his men reached the edges of the Inca Empire in the early 1530s, they encountered a civilization exhausted by civil war and weakened by disease. The once unified state that had dominated the Andes now faced the greatest crisis in its history. Still, Atahualpa remained confident. Reports of strange foreigners had circulated before, but none seemed capable of threatening a realm that governed millions of people. The emperor believed the visitors might represent minor traders or curious wanderers. Their numbers were insignificant compared to the might of Tawantinsuyu. Yet the conquistadors possessed something far more dangerous than numbers. They carried ambition. Driven by dreams of gold, glory, and royal favor from distant Spain, Pizarro's expedition advanced into the highlands seeking contact with the emperor himself. Atahualpa, secure in the belief that his empire remained invincible, agreed to meet them in Cajamarca. The meeting would become one of the most consequential encounters in world history. For the first time, the rulers of the Andes would face representatives of a completely different civilization, one shaped by centuries of European warfare, expansion, and imperial ambition. Neither side fully understood the other. The Inca emperor expected diplomacy. The Spaniards saw opportunity. What followed would shatter the balance of power in the Andes forever. The civil war between Huascar and Atahualpa had already weakened the empire's unity. Now the arrival of foreign invaders threatened to exploit those divisions in ways no one within Tawantinsuyu could yet imagine. Atahualpa stood victorious over his brother. But the greatest challenge to his rule had not yet revealed its true power. In the quiet mountain city of Cajamarca, destiny waited. In the autumn of 1532, the mountain town of Cajamarca rested quietly among the highlands of northern Peru. Surrounded by cold valleys and mist-covered ridges, it was far from the imperial capital of Cusco and far from the great ceremonial centers that symbolized Inca authority. Yet history would soon transform this modest place into the stage for one of the most dramatic encounters ever recorded between civilizations. Atahualpa, victorious in the civil war against his brother Huascar, had established his camp near Cajamarca while consolidating control over the empire. Tens of thousands of soldiers surrounded the region, forming an enormous military presence that reflected the strength of the newly crowned emperor. He had reason to feel secure. The armies that defeated Huascar were hardened by years of warfare. Loyal generals commanded disciplined troops. The empire's administrative machinery was slowly returning to order after the devastation of civil conflict. To Atahualpa, the future of Tawantinsuyu still appeared strong. But approaching the highlands from the coast was a force unlike anything the Inca had encountered before. Francisco Pizarro and his small band of Spanish conquistadors had already spent years exploring the Pacific coast of South America. Their journeys were driven by rumors of immense wealth hidden within a powerful mountain empire. They carried letters from the Spanish crown authorizing conquest in the name of the King of Spain. Yet in truth, they were adventurers, soldiers of fortune seeking glory and gold. By the time Pizarro's expedition entered the Inca world, the Spaniards had learned something critical. The empire they hoped to conquer was not unified. News of the civil war between Huascar and Atahualpa had spread through local communities and traders. The Spaniards understood immediately that division among the Inca could become their greatest advantage. Even so, their numbers were astonishingly small. The expedition consisted of fewer than 200 men. They possessed several dozen horses, a handful of firearms, and steel weapons capable of slicing through the wooden or bronze arms used in the Andes. But these advantages alone could not defeat an empire of millions. What Pizarro needed was opportunity. He found it when he learned that Atahualpa was nearby in Cajamarca. The Spanish leader decided on a daring plan. Instead of avoiding the emperor, he would invite him to a meeting. Such a strategy carried enormous risk. If the Inca armies chose to attack, the conquistadors would almost certainly be destroyed. Yet Pizarro believed that surprise and deception could compensate for their lack of numbers. On November 15, 1532, the Spaniards entered Cajamarca and quietly occupied the central plaza of the town. The streets were empty, the surrounding buildings silent. It was a perfect stage for an ambush. The following day, Atahualpa agreed to meet the strangers. He arrived with a large ceremonial procession, carried upon a golden litter and surrounded by nobles, attendants, and musicians. Although his army camped nearby, the emperor brought only an unarmed retinue into the plaza. He expected diplomacy. To him, the Spaniards were a curiosity, foreigners with strange clothing and unfamiliar animals. As the emperor entered the plaza, the conquistadors remained hidden within surrounding buildings. Then, a Dominican friar named Vicente de Valverde approached Atahualpa. Through an interpreter, Valverde attempted to explain the Christian faith and demanded that the emperor accept the authority of the Spanish king and the Catholic Church. The speech was incomprehensible to the Inca ruler. The concepts of European monarchy and Christian theology had no place within the Andean worldview. Confused and offended, Atahualpa reportedly rejected the demand. At that moment Pizarro gave the signal. Cannons thundered, horses charged, steel swords flashed in the fading light. The Spanish ambush exploded into violence. Inca attendants, unarmed and unprepared, were thrown into chaos. Horses, animals never before seen in the Andes, terrified the crowd as riders slashed through densely packed nobles. Gunfire echoed across the plaza, amplifying panic. Within minutes, hundreds of Atahualpa's attendants lay dead. Yet the Spaniards had only one true objective. They surged toward the emperor himself. Despite the confusion, Atahualpa remained seated on his litter, held aloft by loyal attendants who refused to drop him even as they were cut down. Eventually, the Spaniards seized him. The emperor of the Inca Empire was captured alive. The entire confrontation had lasted less than an hour. In a single evening, the political center of Tawantinsuyu collapsed. The capture of Atahualpa was an extraordinary gamble that succeeded beyond Pizarro's expectations. The Spaniards understood immediately that their prisoner represented both danger and opportunity. As long as the emperor lived, they possessed leverage over the empire. But if he died prematurely, millions of subjects might unite in retaliation. For Atahualpa, the situation was equally complex. He remained the symbolic ruler of Tawantinsuyu even while imprisoned. Through interpreters, he communicated with his generals and provincial governors, attempting to maintain a semblance of authority. Realizing the Spaniards' obsession with gold and silver, Atahualpa proposed an astonishing bargain. In exchange for his freedom, he promised to fill a large room with gold objects and 2 additional rooms with silver. Messengers were sent across the empire to gather treasures from temples and palaces. Statues, ornaments, ceremonial vessels, and intricate artworks began arriving in Cajamarca. For months, the ransom accumulated. To the Spaniards, it represented unimaginable wealth. But the treasure carried tragic significance. Many of the objects melted down by the conquistadors were masterpieces of Andean craftsmanship, created not merely as decoration, but as sacred representations of divine forces. Centuries of artistic tradition were reduced to molten metal. Even after the ransom room was filled, Atahualpa remained imprisoned. Among the Spaniards, disagreements emerged about his fate. Some believed he should be released after fulfilling his promise. Others feared that freeing the emperor would allow him to mobilize the vast Inca armies still loyal to his command. Rumors also spread that Atahualpa had ordered the execution of his rival brother Huascar. Whether true or exaggerated, the accusation reinforced Spanish fears that the emperor remained a dangerous political figure. Eventually, Pizarro and his officers made their decision. Atahualpa would be tried and executed. The charges were presented through translators, idolatry, rebellion against the Spanish crown, and other accusations that reflected European legal concepts rather than Andean traditions. The trial lasted only a short time. The verdict was predetermined. Atahualpa was sentenced to death. Initially, the Spaniards planned to burn him at the stake, a punishment that horrified the emperor because Inca beliefs held that the body must remain intact for the soul to continue its journey. A priest offered him an alternative. If he accepted baptism as a Christian, he would be executed by strangulation instead. Facing inevitable death, Atahualpa agreed. On July 26, 1533, the emperor of the Inca Empire was killed in Cajamarca. His death sent shockwaves across Tawantinsuyu. The man who had just emerged victorious from civil war, the ruler of the largest empire in the Americas, had been destroyed by fewer than 200 foreign invaders. Yet the Spaniards had not conquered the empire. They had only captured its ruler. Beyond Cajamarca, millions of people still lived within the Inca system. Powerful generals commanded large armies. Provincial governors controlled resources and infrastructure. The political structure remained intact, though shaken. Recognizing this reality, the conquistadors attempted to manipulate the imperial system rather than destroy it immediately. They installed a puppet ruler, Tupac Hualpa, hoping to govern the empire through him while advancing toward Cusco. But their presence sparked growing unrest. Many Inca nobles and generals understood that the Spaniards intended domination, not alliance. Resistance began to take shape. The empire had lost its emperor, but its people had not yet surrendered. Across the Andes, rumors spread of betrayal, of foreign invaders who wielded thunderous weapons and rode terrifying animals. Communities debated whether to submit or resist. The Spaniards marched toward the heart of Tawantinsuyu, believing that the capture of Atahualpa had already secured victory. They were mistaken, for although the emperor was dead, the spirit of resistance was only beginning to awaken. The death of Atahualpa did not bring immediate conquest of the Inca Empire. Instead, it created a strange and fragile moment in which the empire still existed, yet its center had vanished. The Spaniards held the emperor's treasure, and his life had ended in Cajamarca. But beyond the walls of that mountain town, the machinery of Tawantinsuyu continued to move. Provincial governors still oversaw fields and storehouses. Roads still carried messengers across the Andes. Armies still waited in distant valleys. The empire had lost its ruler, but not its people. Francisco Pizarro understood that conquering such a vast civilization required more than violence. With fewer than 200 soldiers, he needed legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it. To achieve this, the Spaniards attempted to manipulate the Inca system of leadership. Soon after Atahualpa's execution, they selected a new emperor from among the royal lineage. His name was Tupac Hualpa. The Spaniards presented him as the rightful successor, hoping that the empire's subjects would obey him and therefore indirectly obey Spanish authority. The plan seemed simple: control the emperor and the empire would follow. But Tawantinsuyu was not so easily manipulated. The political traditions of the Inca world recognized the sacred nature of the Sapa Inca, the unique ruler believed to descend from the sun god Inti. While succession disputes were not uncommon, legitimacy required recognition from noble families, priests, and provincial leaders. Tupac Hualpa possessed little of that support. Many nobles saw him as a puppet placed on the throne by foreigners who had murdered the previous emperor. His authority lacked spiritual and political credibility. Nevertheless, the Spaniards began their march toward Cusco, the imperial capital. Their route followed the same roads built by Inca engineers generations earlier. Along the way, they encountered communities uncertain about how to respond to the invaders. Some villages offered supplies and cooperation, believing resistance would bring destruction. Others quietly prepared for rebellion. Meanwhile, the fragile arrangement between the Spaniards and their puppet emperor began to unravel. Tupac Hualpa died suddenly during the journey, possibly from illness or perhaps from poisoning by rivals who rejected his rule. His death forced Pizarro to repeat the strategy. Another member of the royal family was selected to serve as emperor. This time the Spaniards chose Manco Inca Yupanqui. Unlike Tupac Hualpa, Manco Inca possessed stronger connections to the imperial nobility. At first he appeared willing to cooperate with the newcomers, believing that alliance might restore stability after the chaos of civil war and foreign invasion. But beneath the surface tensions were growing. The Spaniards continued advancing through the empire, claiming wealth and demanding submission from local leaders. Their hunger for gold and silver seemed endless. Temples were stripped of sacred objects. Storehouses were opened. Labor networks that once served the Inca state were redirected to support the ambitions of the conquistadors. Many Inca nobles began to realize that Spanish promises of partnership were illusions. Still, resistance remained difficult. The empire had already been weakened by civil war and disease. Its armies were divided, its leadership uncertain. For the moment, cooperation seemed safer than confrontation. By late 1533, the Spaniards reached Cusco. For centuries, this city had stood as the sacred heart of Tawantinsuyu. Its temples honored the sun, its plazas hosted imperial ceremonies, and its stone walls symbolized the authority of the Inca dynasty. Now the conquistadors entered the capital as conquerors. The moment carried enormous symbolic weight. By occupying Cusco, The Spaniards could claim control over the empire's spiritual center, yet the reality was more complicated. Although the city was now under Spanish control, the broader empire remained restless. Many communities had not accepted the new order. Even within Cusco, tensions were constant. Spanish soldiers behaved with arrogance and cruelty, often ignoring the delicate cultural and political structures that governed Inca society. Nobles were humiliated. Sacred spaces were desecrated. Manco Inca watched these developments with growing anger. Initially, he had cooperated with the Spaniards, hoping to preserve some measure of autonomy for his people. But the behavior of the conquistadors made it increasingly clear that they intended to dominate the empire completely. They demanded more gold. They interfered with traditional ceremonies. Some even abused members of the royal family. For Manco Inca, the situation became unbearable. Quietly, he began planning rebellion. Using the same communication networks that had once unified the empire, he sent messages across the Andes. Provincial leaders were instructed to prepare for coordinated resistance. Weapons were gathered. Warriors assembled in secret. The strategy was bold. Instead of scattered uprisings, Manco Inca intended to launch a massive revolt that would surround the Spanish forces in Cusco and destroy them. The opportunity came in 1536. Under the pretense of performing religious ceremonies outside the city, Manco Inca escaped Spanish supervision. Once free, he moved quickly to rally support. Within weeks, tens of thousands of warriors had gathered under his command. The rebellion erupted with astonishing force. Inca armies surrounded Cusco, cutting off supply routes and attacking Spanish positions. Fires burned across the city as defenders struggled to hold their ground. The most intense fighting occurred at the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, a massive stone complex overlooking Cusco. Whoever controlled this fortress could dominate the surrounding area. Inca warriors captured the stronghold and used it as a base to bombard Spanish forces below. For the conquistadors, the situation became desperate. Outnumbered and surrounded, they faced the possibility of annihilation. The rebellion demonstrated that despite years of disruption, the Inca still possessed the ability to mobilize enormous military strength. But the Spaniards held advantages that proved decisive. Their horses allowed rapid movement across the battlefield. Their steel weapons cut through traditional armor. And perhaps most important, the Inca armies lacked unified coordination after years of civil war and leadership disruption. The siege of Cusco lasted months. Fighting raged across the city and surrounding hills. Thousands died on both sides. Eventually, the Spaniards launched a daring assault to retake the fortress of Sacsayhuaman. The battle was brutal. Inca defenders fought fiercely, but Spanish cavalry and allied indigenous forces managed to break through. With the fortress lost, the siege began to collapse. Manco Inca realized that continuing the assault would only bring further destruction without victory. Reluctantly, he ordered a retreat. But the rebellion was not over. Instead of surrendering, Manco Inca withdrew into the remote mountain region of Vilcabamba. There he established a new center of resistance far from Spanish control. The territory was difficult to access, surrounded by forests and steep valleys. For the Spaniards, it represented an elusive enemy. For the Inca, it became a final refuge of independence. From Vilcabamba, the remnants of the Inca state continued to resist Spanish domination. Although the empire of Tawantinsuyu had fallen, the spirit of resistance endured in the mountains. Meanwhile, the Spaniards consolidated their rule across the Andes. New colonial cities were founded. Indigenous labor systems were reorganized to serve Spanish economic interests. Christian missionaries began converting communities to European religion. The transformation of the Andes had begun. Yet the conquest was far from complete. For decades, the Inca of Vilcabamba would remain beyond Spanish control, preserving fragments of their political and cultural traditions while waiting for an opportunity to reclaim their lost empire. The struggle between conqueror and conquered had entered a new phase. The Empire of the Sun had fallen, but its final chapter had not yet been written. High in the tangled forests and steep valleys, beyond the eastern edge of the Andes, lay a region that the Spanish conquistadors struggled to reach, and even struggled to understand. Thick jungle pressed against the mountains, rivers cut deep through stone, and narrow paths disappeared beneath towering vegetation. To the Inca who retreated there, this landscape offered something precious: refuge. After the failed siege of Cusco in 1536, Manco Inca Yupanqui led his followers into this remote territory known as Vilcabamba. Here, far from Spanish control, the remnants of the Inca state attempted to survive. The empire of Tawantinsuyu had fallen, but the Inca dynasty had not vanished. Within the hidden valleys of Vilcabamba, a smaller kingdom began to take shape. For Manco Inca, this retreat was both defeat and opportunity. The rebellion had demonstrated that the Inca still possessed the capacity for large-scale resistance, but it had also revealed the overwhelming advantages of Spanish weaponry and tactics. Open warfare against cavalry and steel had proven disastrous. Survival now required adaptation. Instead of attempting to rebuild the vast empire that once stretched across the Andes, Manco Inca focused on preserving political continuity and cultural identity. Vilcabamba became a sanctuary where the Inca court could continue its traditions away from Spanish domination. Temples were rebuilt. Ceremonies honoring the sun god Inti continued. Royal authority remained intact, even if its territorial reach had shrunk dramatically. The Spanish referred to this region as the Neo-Inca state, a final remnant of the once mighty empire. For the conquistadors and colonial authorities, the existence of Vilcabamba represented a constant threat. As long as an Inca ruler remained beyond their control, rebellion across the Andes remained possible. But eliminating that threat proved difficult. The geography of Vilcabamba favored defense. Dense forests and rugged terrain limited the effectiveness of cavalry. Supply lines were nearly impossible to maintain for large invading forces. Spanish expeditions occasionally attempted to reach the region, but many failed to penetrate its natural barriers. Meanwhile, Manco Inca ruled from his hidden capital, maintaining contact with indigenous communities that still resented Spanish rule. His court preserved the symbols of imperial authority. Royal nobles continued advising the emperor. Messengers traveled through mountain paths connecting Vilcabamba with distant provinces. Although Tawantinsuyu no longer existed as a unified empire, the memory of its greatness remained powerful among Andean peoples. During these years, the Spanish colonial system was also evolving. The conquistadors who had overthrown the Inca Empire did not immediately establish stable governance. Instead, they fought among themselves for control of territory, labor, and wealth. Civil wars erupted between rival Spanish factions. Some conquistadors believed the crown in Spain interfered too much with their authority. Others demanded greater recognition for their role in the conquest. For indigenous communities, these conflicts created moments of opportunity. While the Spaniards fought one another, Manco Inca strengthened his position in Vilcabamba. But peace did not last. In 1544, a small group of Spanish fugitives arrived in the region seeking refuge. These men were rebels who had participated in a failed uprising against Spanish colonial authorities. Manco Inca initially welcomed them. Their knowledge of European weapons and tactics could potentially benefit the Inca resistance. Yet the decision proved fatal. In 1544, the Spanish fugitives betrayed their host. During a confrontation inside Vilcabamba, they assassinated Manco Inca. The ruler who had led the Great Rebellion against Spanish conquest was dead. His assassination shocked the Inca court, but the dynasty endured. Manco Inca's son, Seri Tupac, became the new ruler of Vilcabamba. At this point, the Neo-Inca state faced a difficult choice: Continuing open resistance against Spain carried enormous risks. The empire that once supported Inca power no longer existed. Spanish colonial institutions were spreading across the Andes. Many indigenous communities had been forced into labor systems that tied them economically to Spanish settlements. Under these conditions, prolonged war seemed increasingly impossible. Spanish authorities recognized this reality as well. Instead of immediate military conquest, they attempted diplomacy. Envoys traveled to Vilcabamba, offering peace agreements and recognition of royal status if the Inca ruler accepted Spanish authority. For years, negotiations continued. Eventually, Seri Tupac agreed to leave Vilcabamba and accept Spanish protection. He traveled to Cusco in 1557, where he was baptized as a Christian and granted lands under colonial rule. For the Spanish, this appeared to mark the end of organized Inca resistance, but the reality was more complicated. After Seri Tupac's departure, leadership in Vilcabamba passed to another member of the royal family, Titu Yupanqui. Unlike his predecessor, Titu remained suspicious of Spanish intentions. He continued ruling from the hidden valleys, maintaining the independence of the Neo-Inca state. During his reign, relations between Vilcabamba and the Spanish colony fluctuated between cautious diplomacy and uneasy hostility. Missionaries attempted to convert the inhabitants of Vilcabamba to Christianity. Spanish envoys negotiated treaties, yet trust remained fragile. Titu allowed limited contact with the outside world but resisted full submission to Spanish authority. Meanwhile, the colonial transformation of the Andes accelerated. Spanish cities expanded across former Inca territories. Churches rose where temples once stood. Indigenous labor was organized through systems that extracted silver from mines and crops from fields for export across the Atlantic. The world that had sustained Tawantinsuyu was disappearing. Yet in Vilcabamba, the old traditions endured. The court continued honoring the memory of the Inca emperors. Ceremonies connected the surviving dynasty to the sacred heritage of the sun. For Andean communities living under Spanish rule, the existence of Vilcabamba remained a powerful symbol. It represented the possibility that the Inca legacy had not been entirely extinguished. But history was moving toward an inevitable conclusion. In 1571, Titu Yupanqui died unexpectedly. Leadership passed to the final ruler of the Neo-Inca state. His name was Tupac Amaru. Unlike previous rulers, Tupac Amaru inherited a kingdom facing overwhelming pressure from the expanding Spanish colonial system. The Spanish authorities now viewed Vilcabamba not as a distant curiosity, but as an unacceptable challenge to their control over Peru. A new viceroy had arrived in the colony with clear instructions. The last independent Inca state would be eliminated. Spanish forces prepared for a military expedition into the mountains. Unlike earlier attempts, this campaign would be larger, more organized, and determined to finish the conquest that began decades earlier in Cajamarca. Within Vilcabamba, the situation grew increasingly tense. Messengers reported Spanish troops advancing through the forests. Warriors gathered to defend the final refuge of the Inca dynasty. Yet the imbalance of power was impossible to ignore. The empire that once commanded millions of subjects had been reduced to a single mountain stronghold. Still, the people of Vilcabamba prepared for resistance. For them, the struggle was no longer about rebuilding Tawantinsuyu. It was about preserving dignity, memory, and identity in the face of an unstoppable colonial force. The final confrontation between the Inca dynasty and the Spanish Empire was approaching. In the hidden valleys of Vilcabamba, the last chapter of Inca independence was about to begin. By the early 1570s, the once mighty Inca Empire had been reduced to a final sanctuary hidden within the eastern Andes. The region of Vilcabamba, surrounded by dense forests, steep ridges, and twisting rivers, had served for decades as the last refuge of the Inca dynasty. From this remote stronghold, the Neo-Inca state had preserved fragments of a civilization that once ruled millions across the mountains of South America. But the survival of Vilcabamba could not last forever. In 1571, the fragile balance that had protected the Hidden Kingdom began to collapse. Titu Yupanqui, ruler of the Neo-Inca state and son of the rebel Emperor Manco Inca, died suddenly. His death triggered uncertainty within the court. Leadership passed to his younger brother, Tupac Amaru. Tupac Amaru had spent much of his life within the sacred traditions of the Inca priesthood. Unlike earlier rulers who had navigated diplomacy and war with the Spaniards, he was not deeply experienced in political negotiation. His reign began during a moment when Spanish colonial authorities had already decided that Vilcabamba must be eliminated. The arrival of a new Spanish viceroy in Peru, Francisco de Toledo, marked a turning point. Toledo was a determined administrator who believed that lasting colonial stability required the complete destruction of remaining Inca sovereignty. For him, the continued existence of an independent Inca ruler posed a dangerous symbolic threat. Even though Vilcabamba was geographically isolated and militarily weak, its presence reminded Andean communities that Spanish domination was not absolute. Toledo therefore resolved to end the Neo-Inca state once and for all. The viceroy began preparing a major military expedition. Spanish soldiers were gathered from across colonial settlements. Indigenous allies from communities hostile to the Inca dynasty were recruited to assist the campaign. Supplies were assembled for a difficult march into the forested valleys where Vilcabamba lay hidden. At the same time, Toledo attempted to justify the invasion through diplomatic accusations. He claimed that Tupac Amaru had supported attacks against Spanish missionaries and travelers in the region. Whether these accusations were exaggerated or not mattered little. They provided the legal pretext the Spanish administration desired. In early 1572, the expedition began. Spanish forces advanced through rugged terrain that had frustrated earlier attempts to conquer Vilcabamba. Paths were cut through thick vegetation. Rivers were crossed using temporary bridges. The journey was slow and dangerous. But this time, the Spaniards were determined to succeed. Within Vilcabamba, news of the approaching army spread quickly. The Inca court faced an impossible situation. Their forces were small compared to the Spanish expedition, and their isolation meant that large-scale support from other Andean communities was unlikely. The empire that once provided strength to the Inca rulers had long since been dismantled by decades of colonial control. Nevertheless, Tupac Amaru prepared for resistance. Warriors gathered around the capital city of Vilcabamba. Defensive positions were established along mountain passes and forest trails, but the imbalance of power was overwhelming. Spanish forces possessed firearms, steel weapons, and cavalry. They also had experience fighting in the region after decades of colonial expansion. One by one, the outer defenses of Vilcabamba were broken. The Spanish army advanced steadily toward the capital. When the conquistadors finally reached the city, they found it largely abandoned. Tupac Amaru and many of his followers had fled deeper into the forests in a desperate attempt to escape capture. The Spanish occupation of Vilcabamba marked the symbolic end of the last independent Inca state. Yet the campaign did not end there. Determined to eliminate the dynasty entirely, Spanish commanders launched a pursuit through the jungle. The search lasted weeks. Guided by indigenous allies familiar with the terrain, Spanish soldiers followed trails through dense vegetation and across rivers swollen by mountain rains. Eventually, they located the fleeing emperor. Tupac Amaru was captured along with several members of the royal family and brought back toward the colonial centers of Spanish power. For the Viceroy Toledo, the capture of Tupac Amaru represented the final act in the long conquest of the Andes. But he wanted more than military victory. He wanted a demonstration. The last Inca ruler would be publicly executed. The location chosen for this act was Cusco, the ancient capital of Tawantinsuyu. The choice carried profound symbolism. For centuries, Cusco had served as the sacred heart of the Inca world, the place where emperors ruled in the name of the sun. Now it would become the stage for the destruction of the Inca dynasty. In September 1572, Tupac Amaru was brought to the city. Accounts from witnesses describe a solemn procession through streets once filled with imperial ceremonies. Indigenous communities gathered to watch, many grieving silently for the final ruler of their ancestral empire. Spanish authorities conducted a formal trial. The charges included rebellion against the Spanish crown and responsibility for attacks on missionaries. The outcome was predetermined. Tupac Amaru was sentenced to death. On September 24, 1572, the execution took place in the central plaza of Cusco. Before the assembled crowd, the last emperor of the Inca dynasty was beheaded. With that act, the Neo-Inca state came to an end. The dynasty that had ruled the Andes for generations was extinguished by colonial power. Yet the meaning of Tupac Amaru's death extended far beyond the immediate moment. For Spanish authorities, it represented the completion of conquest. For many Andean people, it became a symbol of loss, resistance, and memory. The empire of Tawantinsuyu was gone. Its roads still crossed the mountains. Its terraces still shaped the land. Its language, Quechua, continued to be spoken by millions, but its political independence had ended. In the years that followed, Spanish colonial rule transformed the Andes in profound ways. Indigenous communities were reorganized into new settlements designed to facilitate taxation and labor extraction. Christian churches replaced temples dedicated to traditional Andean deities. Spanish law and administration reshaped local governance. Mines in regions such as Potosi demanded enormous labor forces, drawing indigenous workers into harsh conditions that supported the global Spanish economy. The transformation of the Andes was not merely political. It was cultural, economic, and spiritual. Yet even as colonial institutions spread across the region, the memory of the Inca Empire did not disappear. Stories of the great rulers, Pachacuti, Topa Inca Yupanqui, Huayna Capac, continued to circulate among indigenous communities. Legends of the lost empire survived in oral traditions. The name Tupac Amaru itself would echo through history. 2 centuries after the fall of Vilcabamba, an indigenous leader named José Gabriel Condorcanqui would adopt the name Tupac Amaru II and lead one of the largest anti-colonial rebellions in South American history. In this way, the legacy of the Inca dynasty remained alive in collective memory. Empires may fall, but the identities they create often endure far longer than their political structures. The execution of Tupac Amaru marked the end of Inca sovereignty, but it did not erase the civilization that had shaped the Andes for centuries. Its influence remained embedded in language, agriculture, architecture, and cultural tradition. The empire of the sun had fallen, yet its legacy would continue to shape the future of the Andes in ways even the conquerors could not fully control. When the execution of Tupac Amaru ended the last independent Inca state in 1572, Spanish authorities believed the story of Tawantinsuyu had concluded. The empire of the sun, once stretching across thousands of kilometers of mountain and desert, had fallen completely under colonial rule. Its final emperor had been executed in the plaza of Cusco. Its last refuge in Vilcabamba had been destroyed. From the perspective of the Spanish Empire, the conquest was finished. But history rarely ends where conquerors believe it does. Although the political structure of the Inca Empire disappeared, the civilization that created it remained deeply embedded within the Andes. Millions of indigenous people continued to live on the same lands their ancestors had farmed for generations. They spoke the same languages, followed many of the same traditions, and carried within their collective memory the story of an empire that had once united their world. The collapse of Inca sovereignty therefore marked not an ending, but the beginning of a long transformation. Spanish colonial rule introduced new institutions that reshaped the Andes in dramatic ways. The colonial government reorganized indigenous communities into settlements called reductions. These villages were designed to concentrate populations under easier supervision by Spanish administrators and missionaries. Traditional settlement patterns that once followed ecological zones of the mountains were disrupted. People who had lived for centuries across terraces and valleys were relocated into centralized towns. For colonial authorities, this system allowed greater control over taxation and labor. For indigenous communities, it represented profound upheaval. At the same time, Spanish economic ambitions transformed the region into a vital source of wealth for the global empire. Silver mines, especially the enormous deposits at Potosi in present-day Bolivia, became central to the colonial economy. The extraction of silver required enormous labor forces. To supply this labor, the Spanish adapted elements of the old Inca mitta system. Under the colonial version, indigenous communities were required to send workers to the mines for extended periods. Conditions were brutal. Thousands of workers endured dangerous tunnels, toxic mercury processing, and exhausting labor deep underground. Silver extracted from Andean mountains traveled across oceans, helping finance Spain's imperial ambitions in Europe and Asia. In this way, the legacy of Inca administrative systems continued to shape the colonial economy, even as indigenous populations suffered under its new form. Religion also became a powerful instrument of colonial transformation. Spanish missionaries spread Christianity across the Andes, building churches where Inca temples once stood. Catholic doctrine replaced the state religion centered on Inti, the sun god. But cultural change was rarely absolute. Many indigenous communities blended Christian beliefs with older Andean traditions. Sacred mountains, rivers, and ancestors remained part of spiritual life, even as churches and saints became visible elements of religious practice. This blending created a unique cultural landscape that combined European and indigenous influences. Meanwhile, the descendants of the Inca nobility occupied an uncertain place within colonial society. Some families attempted to preserve their status by cooperating with Spanish authorities. They learned Spanish language and legal customs, presenting themselves as legitimate heirs to ancient royal lineages. In certain cases, colonial officials even recognized Inca noble titles, granting privileges that distinguished them from ordinary indigenous communities. Yet these privileges were fragile. Colonial power ultimately rested with Spanish administrators, settlers, and military authorities. Even the descendants of emperors now lived under the shadow of foreign rule. Despite these changes, the memory of the Inca Empire remained powerful across the Andes. Stories of Pachacuti's greatness, of imperial roads that crossed mountains, and of temples filled with gold circulated through oral tradition. For indigenous communities facing exploitation and cultural disruption, the past became a source of identity and resilience. Over time, that memory would inspire resistance. The most dramatic example occurred in the late 18th century, more than 200 years after the fall of Vilcabamba. In 1780, a man named José Gabriel Condorcanqui led a rebellion against Spanish colonial rule. Condorcanqui claimed descent from the Inca royal family. To emphasize this heritage, he adopted a powerful name, Tupac Amaru II. The name invoked the last emperor executed in Cusco in 1572. By using it, Condorcanqui transformed himself into a symbolic heir to the lost empire. His rebellion began in the highlands of southern Peru and quickly expanded across large regions of the Andes. Thousands of indigenous peasants joined the uprising. Their grievances were many: heavy taxation, forced labor in mines, and abuses by colonial officials had created widespread anger. The rebellion combined political protest with the powerful memory of Inca sovereignty. For a brief moment, it appeared possible that the colonial system might collapse, but Spanish authorities responded with overwhelming force. After months of fighting, the rebellion was crushed. Tupac Amaru II was captured and executed in 1781. His punishment was intentionally brutal. Spanish officials hoped that such violence would destroy the symbolic power of the Inca legacy. Instead, the execution strengthened the memory of resistance. The name Tupac Amaru became a lasting symbol of indigenous struggle throughout the Andes. Even centuries after the fall of Tawantinsuyu, the identity created by the Inca Empire continued shaping political and cultural movements. Meanwhile, the physical legacy of the empire remained visible across the landscape. Terraced mountainsides still supported agriculture. Stone roads and bridges continued linking remote communities. Cities like Cusco preserved the architectural foundations built by Inca engineers. Spanish colonial buildings often stood directly atop Inca stonework, a powerful visual reminder that one civilization had been built upon another. Perhaps the most remarkable survival was the Quechua language. Originally promoted by the Inca state as a language of administration, Quechua spread across large parts of the Andes. Under Spanish rule, it remained widely spoken among indigenous communities. Today, millions of people across Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and neighboring regions continue to speak Quechua. In this way, the cultural influence of the Inca Empire survived long after its political collapse. By the 19th century, Spanish colonial rule itself began to weaken. Independence movements swept across Latin America as colonial territories sought freedom from European empires. In the Andes, the memory of indigenous civilizations, including the Inca, played an important role in shaping national identities. Leaders of new republics often looked back to the Inca past as a symbol of pre-colonial greatness. Yet independence did not immediately restore justice for indigenous populations. Many communities continued to face economic inequality and cultural marginalization. The legacy of colonial exploitation remained deeply embedded within social structures. Still, the historical memory of Tawantinsuyu persisted. Archaeologists, historians, and indigenous scholars began studying the achievements of the Inca civilization with renewed attention. Sites such as Machu Picchu, long hidden within mountain forests, were brought to global awareness in the early 20th century. The rediscovery of these places transformed international understanding of Andean history. What had once been dismissed as a lost empire became recognized as one of the most sophisticated civilizations ever created in the Americas. Inca achievements in engineering, agriculture, governance, and environmental adaptation captured worldwide admiration. The empire that had fallen centuries earlier returned to global consciousness as a symbol of human ingenuity. Yet the true legacy of the Inca Empire cannot be measured only in monuments or archaeological discoveries. Its influence lives within the cultural identity of millions of Andean people. Their languages, traditions, agricultural practices, and spiritual beliefs continue to reflect the deep historical roots of Tawantinsuyu. Empires rise and fall, but civilizations endure through the people who carry their memory forward. The story of the Inca Empire, therefore, did not end with the execution of its final ruler. Instead, it entered a new phase, one defined not by imperial power but by cultural survival. And as the modern world continues to rediscover the achievements of the Inca, the enduring legacy of the Lords of the Andes remains one of history's most remarkable stories. Empires are often remembered for the moments of their greatest triumphs or the drama of their final collapse. Yet the true measure of a civilization lies not only in the territory it once ruled, but in the enduring legacy it leaves behind. The Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, the four parts together, existed for a remarkably brief moment in human history. Its period of rapid expansion lasted barely a century before the arrival of European conquerors transformed the Andes forever. And yet, centuries after its fall, the imprint of the Inca civilization remains unmistakable across the mountains of South America. To understand the legacy of the Inca Empire is to recognize one of the most extraordinary achievements of human adaptation and organization. The Andes are among the most challenging environments on Earth. High altitudes limit oxygen. Steep slopes complicate agriculture. Earthquakes and landslides reshape the landscape without warning. Rivers carve deep valleys that isolate communities from one another. Most civilizations in world history emerged in fertile plains or along navigable rivers. The Inca built their empire among the mountains. This environmental challenge shaped every aspect of their society. Inca engineers transformed steep hillsides into terraced agricultural systems that captured sunlight, retained water, and prevented erosion. These terraces allowed crops such as maize, potatoes, and quinoa to grow in regions where farming might otherwise have been impossible. The empire's agricultural innovations created a resilient food system capable of sustaining millions. Equally remarkable was the Inca mastery of infrastructure. The Quhapac-Ñan, the great road network of the empire, stretched across deserts, high plateaus, and mountain ridges for more than 40,000 kilometers. Suspension bridges crossed deep canyons. Stone stairways climbed cliffs where ordinary travel would have been unthinkable. Through this network, the Inca connected distant regions into a unified administrative system. Messages carried by chasqui runners moved swiftly across the empire, allowing rulers in Cusco to coordinate activities across vast distances without written language or wheeled transportation. The empire's political organization also demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Rather than relying on currency or traditional markets, the Inca economy was structured around reciprocity and labor obligations. Through the Mita system, communities contributed labor to state projects, building roads, cultivating agricultural fields, constructing temples, and supporting armies. In return, the state redistributed resources through storehouses that protected communities from famine and natural disaster. This system created a form of economic coordination that functioned effectively across one of the world's most difficult terrains. In many ways, Tawantinsuyu represented a sophisticated form of state planning long before such concepts emerged in other parts of the world. Equally significant was the cultural integration achieved by the Inca rulers. The Andes were home to diverse societies long before the rise of the Inca dynasty. Languages, traditions, and regional identities varied widely across the mountains. The Inca did not eliminate this diversity. Instead, they integrated it. Local leaders were incorporated into imperial administration. Regional deities were acknowledged within the broader spiritual framework of the empire. Communities contributed labor and tribute while retaining elements of their cultural identity. This balance between central authority and local autonomy allowed the empire to expand rapidly without constant rebellion. It also explains how Tawantinsuyu unified millions of people across enormous distances in such a short period. Yet the empire's strengths also revealed its vulnerabilities. The system relied heavily on centralized leadership embodied in the Sapa Inca, the emperor believed to be the descendant of the sun god Inti. When that leadership fractured during the civil war between Huascar and Atahualpa, the political stability of the empire weakened dramatically. The arrival of Spanish conquistadors exploited this moment of division. With fewer than 200 soldiers, Francisco Pizarro and his expedition captured Atahualpa in Cajamarca and triggered a cascade of events that destroyed the imperial system. The conquest of the Inca Empire remains one of history's most striking examples of how technological advantages, disease, political division, and strategic deception can reshape entire civilizations. Yet conquest did not erase the achievements of the Inca. Their architecture still stands as testimony to remarkable engineering. Cities like Cusco reveal stonework so precise that individual blocks fit together without mortar. The fortress of Sacsayhuaman displays massive stones weighing many tons, assembled with astonishing accuracy. And perhaps the most famous symbol of Inca achievement, the mountain city of Machu Picchu, continues to inspire awe. Hidden among mist-covered peaks, Machu Picchu reflects the sophisticated understanding of astronomy, landscape, and architecture that defined Inca culture. Terraces stabilize the slopes. Temples align with celestial events. Water channels carry mountain springs through carefully carved stone. The city demonstrates a harmony between human construction and natural environment rarely matched in world history. But the true legacy of the Inca Empire extends far beyond monuments. It survives in the living cultures of the Andes. Millions of people continue to speak Quechua, the language promoted by the Inca state. Agricultural traditions developed centuries ago still guide farming practices in mountain communities. Festivals blend Catholic and Andean spiritual traditions, reflecting the complex cultural fusion created during the colonial period. Even political movements throughout Latin American history have drawn inspiration from the memory of Tawantinsuyu. The name Tupac Amaru, taken from the final Inca ruler executed in 1572, has become a symbol of resistance and cultural pride. Across centuries, the story of the Inca Empire has remained part of Andean identity. Modern scholarship has also reshaped global understanding of the Inca civilization. Early European chroniclers often misunderstood or underestimated the complexity of Andean societies. But archaeological discoveries and indigenous historical research have revealed a far more sophisticated picture. The Inca developed advanced knowledge of agriculture, medicine, astronomy, and environmental management. Their political system coordinated enormous labor forces without written alphabets or metal currency. Their architecture and infrastructure rivaled many achievements of the ancient world. In recent decades, historians have begun to recognize the Inca Empire as one of the most innovative civilizations in human history. Yet the story of Tawantinsuyu also carries a powerful lesson. It reminds us that civilizations are shaped not only by conquest or technology, but by relationships between people and the environments they inhabit. The Inca did not dominate the Andes by forcing nature into submission. They learned to work with it. Terraces followed the contours of mountains. Cities were placed where landscapes offered stability and harmony. Agriculture adapted to altitude and climate rather than attempting to replace them. This philosophy of environmental adaptation allowed the Inca to transform one of the world's harshest landscapes into the center of a thriving civilization. Today, as humanity faces new environmental challenges, the lessons of the Andes remain relevant. The achievements of the Inca Empire demonstrate that sustainable systems can emerge from deep understanding of local ecosystems. They remind us that resilience often depends on cooperation, adaptability, and respect for the natural world. 5 centuries after its fall, the Empire of the Sun still speaks through the mountains, in the terraces carved into hillsides, in the languages spoken by Andean communities, in the ancient roads that continue crossing deserts and valleys, and in the enduring memory of a civilization that once united the Andes under the golden light of Inti. The Inca Empire may have disappeared as a political power, but its spirit endures in the landscapes and cultures of South America. For the lords of the Andes built more than an empire. They built a legacy that continues to shape the world.